He left her 9 months ago without a word. But tonight, when the Mafia boss burst into that hospital room in rage, he froze, because the woman he abandoned was holding 3 tiny lives that all looked just like him. What happened next changed both their hearts forever. The thunder rolled like an angry god across the night sky, shaking the glass panes of the hospital window. Rain came down in heavy sheets, slapping the concrete with a rhythm that matched the pulse in Isabella's throat. The air was sharp with the scent of antiseptic, metal, and fear. Her fingers clutched the white bedsheet, twisting it as another contraction tore through her like lightning. Pain and panic collided inside her chest, but she bit her lip until she tasted blood, refusing to scream again. The world around her blurred into motion, doctors shouting, nurses hurrying, the steady beep of monitors cutting through the chaos. Somewhere beyond the bright lights and the sterile walls, a storm raged that felt eerily like the one inside her. She could barely process what was happening. It was too soon. The babies weren't supposed to come yet. Not like this, not tonight, not when she was so completely alone. 9 months of solitude had carved silence into her bones. 9 months since the night Dominic had walked out of their home, leaving the air filled with shattered words and unspoken love. He had said he needed to fix things, to protect her, but protection had felt like abandonment. And now, as her body fought to bring life into a world she barely trusted anymore, his absence pressed on her chest like a weight she couldn't shake off. The pain came again, harder, crueler this time. She arched against it, her breath catching in shallow gasps. The doctor's voice cut through the blur, calm but firm, guiding her through the agony. Yet all she could hear was the echo of his voice, the way he had said her name that last night before walking away. Bella. It had sounded like a prayer, a plea, and a promise all at once. But promises meant nothing when silence followed them. Every contraction brought back the memory of him, the way his eyes had burned with conflict, the way his hand had lingered on the doorknob as though part of him wanted to stay. She had begged him not to go, to leave that shadowed world of violence and deceit, to choose her instead. But he had chosen silence. Now, every ounce of pain felt like punishment for still missing him. The storm outside intensified, lightning slicing through the sky and briefly illuminating the hospital corridor. The lights flickered, momentarily plunging the room into darkness. Isabella's heart lurched, fear surging in her veins. She wasn't just afraid of the delivery. She was afraid of what came after. What would she tell her children? That their father was a ghost made of secrets and gunpowder? That love had nearly destroyed them both? She wanted to believe she had moved past him, that she no longer longed for the warmth of his arms or the sound of his voice. But pain has a way of stripping away pretense, and in that raw moment, she realized she still loved him with every trembling breath. Her mind drifted to the night he left. The argument had started over something small. A phone call he wouldn't explain. A gun she found hidden beneath his jacket. But beneath those sparks lay years of suppressed fear. She had told him she couldn't raise a child in his world of blood and loyalty. He had said there was no other way to survive. When he stormed out, she thought he'd cool down and come back before dawn. Instead, days turned to weeks, and weeks to months. She tried to hate him, but every heartbeat betrayed her. The doctor's command snapped her back. "It's time, Isabella, push." Her body obeyed, but her mind was elsewhere, trapped between love and resentment, between memories of his warmth and the cold emptiness he left behind. The pain was unbearable, but somewhere deep within it, a spark of strength ignited. She wasn't the frightened woman he had left behind. She was someone else now. Someone who had carried life through heartbreak, someone who had learned to breathe through pain. The sound that broke the air then was unlike anything she'd ever heard. A baby's cry. Her baby. The doctor lifted the tiny, fragile bundle and handed it to the nurse. Isabella's tears spilled freely as the child's small voice echoed through the room, filling the silence that had haunted her for months. For a brief second, everything was still. The storm quieted. The monitors hummed softly. Her chest rose and fell with relief and disbelief. But then, Another contraction. Her body wasn't done. The nurse's voice was urgent again, the doctor's hands steady, guiding her through the storm once more. Pain flooded her anew, sharp and consuming. She clutched the sheets again, crying out this time, unable to contain it. Her vision swam, sweat slicked her forehead. Through blurred eyes, she saw movement near the door, a shadow, fleeting, like a trick of her exhausted mind. The wind howled outside, pushing rain against the glass. She thought she heard footsteps in the hallway, heavy, hurried, out of rhythm with the hospital's order. The nurses didn't seem to notice. Her mind must be playing cruel tricks. Another contraction gripped her, and she screamed through it, body trembling, heart racing. Her eyes darted to the door again. Nothing. Just the flash of lightning. 9 months. That's how long she'd been waiting for him. Not waiting, she corrected herself. Healing. Moving on. Or at least pretending to. She told herself she was done whispering his name in the dark, done tracing the ghost of his touch on her skin. But when the doctor said, "One more, Isabella, you can do this," she felt his name rise unbidden to her lips. "Dominic," the word slipped out, half a breath, half a cry, and with it came a strange peace, as if her body needed to speak his name to release the pain that had been trapped inside her all this time. The second cry filled the room, softer, smaller than the first. She turned her head weakly, tears blurring her vision as another nurse lifted the newborn. 2 tiny miracles, 2 hearts that carried pieces of a man she had tried to forget. The room seemed to spin as exhaustion settled deep in her bones. The nurse smiled at her, saying something reassuring, but Isabella could barely hear. Her mind floated between reality and memory, the scent of gunpowder, the warmth of his hand on her waist, the promise that he'd come back when it was safe. She had stopped believing in safety long ago. And then, just as the world seemed to calm, a new sound cut through the air, a cry, faint but distinct. Her eyes fluttered open in disbelief. Another one, a third. Triplets. The realization hit her like a shockwave. 3 lives, 3 pieces of the love she thought was lost. Her heart stuttered under the weight of it, torn between wonder and sorrow. She wanted him to see them, to see what they had created, what she had endured. But he was gone, and she was still alone. The thunder crashed again, louder than before, shaking the ceiling. The lights flickered once more, and this time, when her eyes darted toward the door, it wasn't empty. It swung open with force, hitting the wall. Cold air rushed in, carrying the scent of rain and danger. For a moment, everyone in the room froze. The nurses turned, startled. The doctor glanced up in irritation, and then everything stopped. Dominic stood there. Rain clung to his hair, dripping down the collar of his black shirt. His chest rose and fell rapidly, as if he had run for miles. His eyes, those dark, unyielding eyes she once knew better than her own heartbeat, were wide with disbelief. He looked like a man caught, between worlds, between guilt and longing. For a second, no one moved. The storm outside quieted, as though even nature was holding its breath. Isabella's mind couldn't process what she was seeing. The pain, the exhaustion, the sheer weight of the moment made her question if this was real. He had promised to return, but promises had turned to ghosts. Yet here he was, rain-drenched, breathless, alive. Her chest ached with confusion. Was this mercy or punishment? The man who had abandoned her stood at the edge of her world again, and she didn't know whether to reach for him or to scream. The doctor barked orders, nurses resumed their movement, but the energy in the room had shifted entirely. Isabella's eyes locked on his, a silent war of emotions crossing between them. He took a slow step forward, his shoes squeaking against the wet floor. His gaze fell on the 3 tiny bundles lying beside her, and his expression shattered. The air grew heavy, the sound of rain faded, and for a heartbeat, time itself seemed to stop. Her heart pounded in her ears. The last image before her eyes closed was his face, pale, broken, filled with something she couldn't name. Then everything went quiet again, leaving behind only the soft cries of newborns and the echo of the storm outside. And in that silence, one truth pulsed louder than thunder. Dominic was back. The air in the hospital room seemed to thicken as Dominic stepped inside, rainwater dripping from his sleeves and pooling on the sterile floor. The scent of damp asphalt clung to him, mingling with the sharp tang of antiseptic and blood. His breath came in uneven bursts, each one trembling with disbelief. The thunder outside seemed to fade into silence, as though the storm itself had stopped to watch. His eyes, dark, desperate, searching, found her, and everything else in the world disappeared. Isabella lay on the bed, pale and trembling, the color drained from her lips. Her chest rose and fell in shallow motions, exhaustion pulling her downward, but her eyes, those fierce, tear-bright eyes, found him instantly. For a heartbeat, neither moved. It was as if 9 months of distance and hurt had solidified into the air between them, invisible but suffocating. He opened his mouth, but the word barely escaped. Her name, fragile as shattered glass. Isabella! Her body stiffened, the name slicing through her like a blade. It was a sound she had dreamt of and dreaded in equal measure. Her throat burned as she turned her face away, eyes fixed on the small form of her newborn beside her. The nurse's hands moved quickly, wrapping the second baby in a soft blanket. But Isabella's heartbeat drowned out everything else. "You don't get to say my name now," she gasped, her voice raw from both pain and memory. The words came out broken, but sharp enough to wound. Dominic's chest rose, his breath catching. He took one small step forward, his hands trembling as though he didn't trust them. His fingers hovered over the bed, uncertain whether he had the right to reach out. "I didn't know," he said finally, voice hoarse, the storm of regret bleeding through every word. Her jaw clenched, and she met his gaze at last. There was no warmth there, only a cold, cutting disbelief. "You didn't ask," she hissed. Each word struck him like a bullet, measured, merciless. The nurse carefully placed the second baby in Isabella's arms, and Dominic's gaze followed the movement as though the sight alone was too much to bear. His face drained of color, lips parting in silent shock. Two small bundles, wrapped in white, breathing softly against her chest. For a moment, he forgot how to breathe. "Twins?" he managed to whisper, his voice breaking under the weight of the revelation. Before she could respond, another sound sliced through the room, softer, smaller, more fragile than the rest. A third cry, weak, searching. It came from the far end of the bed where another nurse bent over a bassinet, the sound as them both. Dominic's knees nearly gave way as his gaze darted toward the tiny form wrapped in pale blue. "Triplets," he breathed, the word barely forming, half awe, half horror. His hands dropped to his sides as though the truth was too heavy to hold. 3. He hadn't been there for even one. The sight was too much for Isabella to bear. She clutched the babies closer, instinctively shielding them, as if she feared he might vanish again. Or worse, take them into that world she had fought to escape. Her lips trembled, her voice quivering between rage and heartbreak. "You left me alone," she whispered, each word soaked in months of sleepless nights and silent tears. Dominic swallowed hard, his throat tight, his heart pounding in his chest like it wanted to escape. He looked at her, truly looked, and the reality of what he had done hit with the force of a gunshot. The woman before him wasn't the same one he had left behind. She was stronger now, but there was a hollow place behind her eyes that hadn't been there before, a space carved by absence. He wanted to say something, anything, but his voice faltered. The room was too bright, too quiet, too sacred. The sound of rain against the window was the only thing that dared to move between them. His mind flashed back to the night he left, the argument, the gun on the table, her shaking hands, the door closing between them. He had thought leaving would keep her safe. Instead, he had destroyed her. Isabella's heartbeat echoed in her ears. Every time she looked at him, her chest twisted between longing and anger. His face was thinner now, sharper, shadowed by guilt. There were faint scars across his knuckles, reminders of the world he had chosen over her. And yet, despite everything, her body remembered him. The air around them still carried the electricity of what once was. She tried to breathe through it, but it felt like inhaling fire. Every nerve in her body screamed that she should hate him. Yet seeing him standing there, broken and drenched, something inside her cracked. Not forgiveness, but recognition. It was the ghost that had haunted her through every sleepless night. Dominic's gaze dropped to the triplets. His lips parted, trembling. "You carried all this alone?" he murmured, voice thick with disbelief. She turned her face away, tears spilling freely now. "You left me alone," she said again, softer this time, not as accusation but as truth. It was a confession, a wound reopened. The silence that followed was unbearable. It filled every corner of the room, heavier than the storm outside. His guilt pressed down like chains, while her exhaustion blurred everything into gray. The only sound was the rhythmic breathing of 3 tiny lives between them. Proof of love, proof of pain, proof that something sacred had survived in spite of them both. Dominic wanted to reach out, to touch her shoulder, to brush away the sweat-matted strands of hair from her face, to say he was sorry. But he knew an apology wouldn't mend 9 months of abandonment. His hands fell uselessly to his sides. He had fought wars, faced death, commanded men with fear in their eyes. Yet in front of her, he was powerless. Isabella blinked through tears, her gaze dropping to her children. 3 miracles, 3 weights of love and loss. She wondered if they would ever know their father, if she would ever let them. Dominic took another hesitant step closer, his shoes echoing faintly against the tile. The nurse moved quietly out of the room, sensing the air too charged for interruption. The door clicked shut behind her. The storm outside grew louder again, matching the rhythm of their hearts. For the first time they were alone, truly alone, after months of silence. The distance between them was only a few feet, but it felt like years. He tried to speak, but no words came. His throat burned, his eyes stung. Every second felt like standing on the edge of something fragile. His pulse thundered in his ears as he stared at her. The woman he'd once sworn to protect, the woman he'd left behind in the ruins of his own choices. Isabella finally looked up, meeting his gaze fully. What he saw there stripped him bare, not anger, not forgiveness, but something deeper. It was the quiet recognition of 2 souls who had once belonged to each other and now stood as strangers, bound by blood. The lightning flashed again, filling the room with white light. In that instant, Dominic saw the faint tremor in her fingers, the way she clutched their children tighter, not out of love, but fear. He realized then that he hadn't just lost her trust. He had become the threat she once feared most. And yet, she didn't tell him to leave. He took a breath, slow and deliberate, as though afraid of breaking the air. Every instinct in him wanted to promise her safety, to swear he'd never walk away again. But promises had no weight in a world like his. All he could do was stand there, drenched and trembling, and hope she didn't look away. Outside, thunder rolled closer, the kind that warned of something worse still coming. The lights flickered once more, and a low hum began somewhere down the hall, distant, mechanical, almost menacing. Isabella's eyes darted toward the sound, then back to him. Dominic's jaw tightened. There was something in his stance, alert, protective, the kind of readiness that belonged to the man she'd tried to forget. Her pulse quickened. "What is it?" she whispered, though part of her didn't want to know. He didn't answer. His gaze shifted toward the door, every muscle in his body coiled, listening. The soft whimper of one of the babies broke the silence, fragile and pure, a sound too innocent for the air now heavy with unspoken fear. Dominic turned back toward her, his eyes darkening with an emotion she couldn't read. In that instant, Isabella realized the storm that had brought him here wasn't over. It had only followed him inside. And as lightning struck somewhere beyond the hospital, the lights blinked out completely, leaving them in utter darkness. The silence that followed was not peace, it was warning. The darkness that swallowed the room was thick and absolute. For a moment there was nothing but the rhythm of breathing, hers, his, and the fragile sounds of their newborns nestled between them, A faint emergency light flickered in the hallway, casting a dim orange glow through the window's edge. Dominic stood still, his body rigid, listening to every sound beyond the walls. His instincts from years in the shadows screamed at him that something was wrong. But as the silence stretched, the hum died, and the world seemed to exhale again, leaving behind only the slow pulse of quiet and the scent of rain leaking through the broken night. Isabella's fingers trembled around the edge of the blanket. Her eyes adjusted to the faint light, finding the outline of Dominic's face, half hidden in darkness, half illuminated by storm flashes outside. He hadn't moved closer, but his presence filled the room like smoke, heavy, inescapable. Slowly she turned her gaze toward the sleeping triplets, their soft breaths, the only thing anchoring her to calm. It was over, she told herself. The danger was gone. The storm outside was just weather now, but her heart refused to believe it. When the chaos quieted, Dominic dragged a chair closer to her bed, the metal scraping softly against the tile. He sat down, elbows resting on his knees, eyes never leaving her. Between them lay their children, 3 tiny lives that had reshaped everything. He didn't speak for a long while. The air between them was thick with words unsaid, and the quiet hum of the emergency lights only deepened the ache of what had been lost. "Why didn't you tell me?" His voice finally broke through the silence, low, rough, like gravel scraping against regret. She didn't look at him. Her gaze stayed fixed on the ceiling, tracing invisible cracks, her face unreadable. "'Cause I couldn't survive watching you choose that world again." Her tone was steady, but every syllable trembled with truth. Dominic's chest rose sharply, his jaw tightening. Her words hit him like a wound reopening. He wanted to protest, to explain, but his heart, his damned, loyal, guilt-ridden heart, knew she was right. "I left to protect you," he said at last. The words quiet, but weighted with years of pain. His voice carried the echo of gunfire, betrayal, and every ghost he had tried to bury. Isabella's lips twitched into a bitter, humorless laugh. It was soft, but it sliced through the air like glass. "No, Dominic," she whispered, turning her head just enough for him to see the tears glistening on her lashes. "You left because you're scared of being loved." The words struck something deep inside him, something he didn't know still existed. He looked away, unable to bear the truth in her eyes. Her accusation wasn't anger, it was revelation. Every wall he had built, every distance he'd forced between them, crumbled beneath that single truth. His breath caught in his chest, heavy, uneven. The room felt smaller, the air thinner. He had faced death without flinching, but this, her pain, this was the one thing that made him tremble. Slowly, almost without realizing it, his hand reached toward hers. It was a hesitant motion, as though he feared she might vanish if he moved too quickly. His fingertips brushed against her knuckles, tentative, uncertain. For a heartbeat, she didn't pull away. The warmth of his touch slipped through her like a memory she had buried too deep. Nights when his hands had steadied her trembling heart, when his voice had been the only thing that quieted her storms. Her breath hitched, and her eyes fluttered closed for a moment. The connection was fragile, electric, a spark caught between 2 people who had burned everything they'd once built. Dominic's fingers curled slightly, not gripping, just touching, as though he was afraid to hope, and in that single heartbeat, something in her softened, not forgiveness, but recognition. She remembered the man who used to hold her as if she were the only peace he'd ever known, the man who had whispered her name in the dark when the world felt like it was collapsing. But that memory was dangerous, and she knew it. Slowly, painfully, she pulled her hand away. The air between them chilled instantly, the warmth replaced by distance once more. Her voice was quiet but steady, carrying the weight of boundaries carved by heartbreak. "Don't touch me unless you plan to stay." The words lingered in the air, sharp and final, slicing through the fragile calm. Dominic froze, her voice echoing in his mind. Stay. The word tasted foreign to him, something beautiful, something he had never been able to give. His life had always been built on leaving, on running before the world took from him what he loved. But as he looked at her, pale and fierce, with their children sleeping between them, he felt something unfamiliar, the pull of roots he didn't know he wanted. His throat tightened, but no words came. The storm outside began again, rain pattering against the glass like whispered warnings. Isabella turned her head away, exhaustion tracing lines beneath her eyes. She wanted to close them and wake up in a world where he hadn't returned, where her heart didn't still react to his presence. But she couldn't. The memories were too vivid, the scars too deep. Dominic leaned back slightly, running a hand through his wet hair, his gaze falling to the babies. 3 fragile reasons to change. 3 reminders of everything he'd missed. His heart ached with a guilt that words couldn't fix. He wanted to reach for them, to hold them, to feel something real after years of numbness. But he didn't. He stayed where he was, afraid his touch might break the peace they'd barely found. The hum of machines returned faintly as the power stabilized, washing the room in a cold, sterile light once more. Isabella blinked, the brightness stinging her tired eyes. Dominic's shadow stretched long across the floor, like the ghost of every promise he had broken. For a while, neither spoke. The world had quieted again, but it was the kind of silence that hurt. He watched her breathe, her chest rising and falling with the rhythm of exhaustion. He wanted to tell her everything. The reason he left, the men who had threatened her life, the blood he had shed to keep her safe. But how could he, when safety had come wrapped in loneliness? Her voice broke through his thoughts, soft but edged. You can't protect me by disappearing, Dominic. That's not love. That's fear dressed as sacrifice. He looked up sharply, their eyes locking again. She didn't flinch. For the first time, he saw not just pain, but strength, the kind that comes from surviving what should have destroyed you. His pulse quickened. You think I was scared of love? He asked, voice low, almost disbelieving. You were terrified of it, she said simply, her tone like calm fire. Because love means staying. It means facing the things you can't control. And that's something your world never taught you to do. Her words hit harder than bullets. He wanted to deny it, but the truth was already bleeding through him. He had always run from tenderness, from the risk of needing someone more than himself. Love had been his greatest weakness, and she, the only person who had seen that truth clearly. Dominic leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, his head bowed. The weight of her words pressed down like gravity. I don't know how to fix what I broke, he murmured. Isabella closed her eyes, tears slipping quietly down her cheeks. You don't fix it, she whispered. You live with it. You earn it back, one choice at a time. The sound of one of the babies stirring cut through the silence, a soft whimper that pulled both their gazes down. Dominic instinctively reached forward, his hands hovering above the child, unsure, afraid, reverent. Isabella watched him, the way his expression shifted from hardness to awe, from control to vulnerability. He looked like a man realizing what he'd almost lost, and for a fleeting second she saw the man she had loved, not the Mafia leader, not the ghost who disappeared into the dark, but the man who once made her believe in forever. That vision tore through her composure. Her chest ached, her pulse stuttered. She turned her head sharply, refusing to let him see the crack forming again. Dominic's gaze lingered on her, his heart pounding against the cage of his ribs. He wanted to reach for her again, but the echo of her warning stopped him cold. Don't touch me unless you plan to stay. The sentence burned through his veins, anchoring itself deeper with every breath. The storm outside began to wane, but the one inside the room only grew thicker, quieter, darker, more dangerous. He sat there, hands trembling, eyes fixed on her profile as she pretended to sleep. But she wasn't sleeping. Her tears had soaked into the pillow, her heart still bleeding from his absence and his sudden return. The babies slept peacefully, unaware that their first night in this world was painted with heartbreak and unfinished love. Dominic exhaled shakily, his chest heavy. His world, the one built on blood and power, suddenly felt meaningless in the face of this fragile silence. But as he looked at Isabella again, one truth began to take root inside him. He couldn't leave this time, not again. Yet, before he could say it, before he could even decide if he meant it, the sound of distant footsteps echoed in the hallway, slow, deliberate, growing closer. Dominic's head snapped toward the door, instincts flaring like fire. The storm outside might have passed, but something else was coming, something that would not let him stay in peace. The night dissolved slowly into a pale, uncertain dawn. The storm that had raged for hours finally gave way to silence, the kind that lingered after chaos, heavy, watchful, almost fragile. The hospital smelled faintly of rain and antiseptic, the scent of cleansing after destruction. Isabella stirred, her eyelids fluttering open to the faint wash of morning light slipping through the blinds. For a fleeting second, she thought the last 24 hours had been a dream, a cruel, vivid trick of her exhausted mind. But then she felt it, the weight across her shoulders. A dark, familiar coat draped over her, warm still from the body that had placed it there. Her chest tightened. She turned her head, and there he was. Dominic sat in the chair beside her bed, his elbows resting on his knees, his head bowed slightly as if deep in thought. His clothes were still damp, his hair disheveled, a cut across his knuckles that he hadn't even bothered to clean. He looked nothing like the ruthless man she remembered, the one whose name was whispered with fear in the underworld. He looked human, haunted. The sight disarmed her more than any threat ever could. She tried to move, but the ache in her body reminded her of what it had endured. A soft groan escaped her lips, and Dominic's head lifted instantly. His eyes, hollow yet gentle, met hers, and something in them broke the distance between them. He leaned forward slightly, his voice low, careful not to wake the sleeping triplets. "The doctor said you need rest," he murmured. He reached for the glass of water on the bedside table, holding it out to her. His hand trembled slightly, not from fear, but from restraint. Isabella hesitated before taking it, her fingers brushing his just for a heartbeat. That brief touch burned through both of them, a silent reminder of all they hadn't said. She sipped the water slowly, her throat raw. "You stayed," she whispered finally, her voice soft but wary. Dominic's eyes flickered, something unreadable passing through them. "I had to." The simplicity of the answer unsettled her. Nothing about him was ever simple. She set the glass down carefully, her gaze never leaving his. "Why are you really here, Domi?" "Nick?" The question hung between them like smoke, thick, dark, and dangerous. His jaw tightened, the muscle twitching as if the words he wanted to say carried weight he wasn't ready to share. He looked away for a moment, his gaze falling to the floor. "Because someone found out about the babies." The words came out quiet, but they struck like a gunshot. Isabella froze, her pulse spiked, her fingers clutching the edge of the blanket. "What do you mean, someone found out?" Her voice trembled, rising despite her effort to keep calm. Dominic met her eyes again, his expression grim, all traces of gentleness hardening into something sharper. Vance. The name alone carried a chill. Even before Dominic spoke another word, Isabella knew. She had heard that name once, whispered in the edges of his old life, spoken in tones of fear and hate. Vance. The man who wanted what Dominic refused to give. Power, control, and everything that came with it. Dominic's voice dropped lower. "He'll come for them." The words seemed to echo, bouncing off the sterile walls and into the hollow of her chest. For a second, she couldn't breathe. Her hands flew protectively to the small bundles sleeping beside her, instinct taking over. "You brought danger into this room," she whispered, her voice shaking with disbelief and rage. Dominic's face darkened, his posture straightening as he stepped closer. "No, Bella," he said, his tone calm but laced with an undercurrent of steel. "Danger was already here." She frowned, her lips parting in confusion and anger. "What does that mean?" His gaze softened, but only slightly. "You're mine," he said quietly, the words both a confession and a curse. "And that makes you a target." Isabella's breath caught. She wanted to argue, to deny the weight of his claim, but deep inside, she knew he was right. The world he came from didn't let go. Not of names, not of blood, not of love. She had spent months running from his shadow, thinking she could find safety in distance, but distance meant nothing to men like Vance. Dominic took another step toward her, slow and deliberate. His eyes never left hers. His hand rose almost unconsciously, his fingertips brushing the line of her cheek before he could stop himself. The touch was feather-light, reverent, and dangerous all at once. "And I'll die," he whispered, voice trembling against the quiet, "before I let anyone touch what's mine." Isabella's heart twisted violently inside her chest. The sound of his voice, low, raw, filled with something she couldn't name, dragged her back through years of memory. Nights when his whispers had been promises, days when his protection had felt like a prison. She wanted to push him away, to scream that she wasn't his anymore, but her throat closed around the words. Because deep down, despite the fury and the fear, she still remembered what it felt like to be loved by him. Dangerously, completely, ruinously. Dominic's eyes searched hers, his thumb tracing the faint curve of her jaw, and for a second the world outside disappeared. There was no Mafia, no blood, no danger. Only them, caught in the fragile stillness between past and present. But then, the faintest sound cut through the quiet. A creak in the hallway, a door closing too softly to be random. Dominic's body went rigid, his instincts flaring to life. He straightened, his hand falling away from her face, his eyes darting to the doorway. Isabella's breath hitched. "What is it?" she whispered. He didn't answer. His gaze sharpened, the tenderness in him shuddered by something colder. The transformation was subtle but terrifying. The man replaced by the predator. The room seemed to hold its breath. Dominic moved toward the door in silence, every step precise. The light from the hallway spilled faintly across the floor, flickering once before steadying. He peered into the corridor, his shoulders tense, his stance protective. For a few endless seconds, there was nothing. Only the faint beep of the monitors and the whisper of rain against the glass. Then he closed the door softly, locking it. When he turned back to her, his expression was unreadable. "We don't have much time," he said quietly. Isabella's pulse pounded in her ears. "What do you mean?" Dominic approached her again, but now every movement carried urgency. "If Vance knows about the babies, he'll send someone. Maybe he already has." Her throat went dry. "Then we have to leave." He shook his head. "Not yet. You're weak. They're newborns. You wouldn't survive the road tonight." "Then what do you expect me to do, Dominic? Wait here for him to find us?" Her voice cracked under the pressure of fear. Dominic stopped at the edge of her bed, his hands gripping the railing as he leaned closer. "I'll protect you," he said, each word heavy, absolute. "That's not enough," she shot back. "You can't keep saving me with violence." His jaw clenched. "It's the only language men like him understand." "Then maybe it's time you stopped speaking it," she whispered. He looked at her for a long time, his silence saying more than words ever could. Behind the anger in his eyes, she saw it. The man buried beneath the years of war and sin. The man she had once believed could change. But could he? His breathing grew heavier. "Bella," he said softly, almost pleading, "you don't understand what he's capable of." "No," she replied, meeting his gaze head-on. "You don't understand what I'm capable of. I carried your children alone, Dominic. I fought every night to survive without you. Don't stand there and tell me what fear feels like." The words shook him. His grip on the railing tightened until his knuckles turned white. For a moment, he said nothing. Then he lowered his head, exhaling slowly, as if surrendering to the truth in her voice. "You're right," he murmured. "You shouldn't have had to fight alone." Isabella blinked, caught off guard by the softness in his tone. He raised his eyes to hers again, and this time there was no mask, just a man stripped bare of every wall he'd ever built. "But you won't fight alone." "Again," he said, "not while I'm breathing." Before she could respond, the faint hum of the hospital changed, a power shift, a mechanical whir from the lower floors. The lights dimmed for a heartbeat. Dominic's head snapped toward the window, his instincts flaring again. Isabella followed his gaze and froze. Across the street, through the rain-blurred glass, a shadow stood motionless on the opposite rooftop, too still, too deliberate to be anything but human. Dominic's voice dropped to a whisper. "They're already here." The words barely left his mouth before the light in the room flickered again, plunging them momentarily into half-darkness. Isabella's breath caught, her body going cold. Dominic reached for his coat, pulling a small handgun from the inner pocket. The sight of it made her chest tighten. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "Not here. Not now." He turned to her, his eyes fierce but calm. "Stay quiet. Stay with them." The babies stirred, one letting out a faint cry, sensing the tension that thickened the air. Dominic stepped toward the window, his silhouette merging with the dawn. His voice came low, certain, and dangerous. "If Vance sent them, they won't leave this building alive." Isabella clutched the blankets tighter around her children, tears burning behind her eyes. She wanted to scream at him to stop, to stay, to not become that man again, the one who solved everything with violence. But she couldn't, because deep down, she knew he was the only thing standing between them and the world that wanted to destroy them. The silence stretched for one heartbeat too long. Then, from the hallway, came the faint metallic click of a door unlocking. Dominic's eyes narrowed. He turned his head slightly toward her, his voice barely above a whisper. "Whatever happens, don't make a sound." Isabella's heart pounded so loud she thought the intruder might hear it. And the air turned electric again, charged with fear, love, and something darker, the shadow of a past that refused to die. Dominic moved toward the door, his gun low, his steps soundless. The creak came again, closer. Isabella's breath trembled as she held her babies against her chest, her mind flashing through every nightmare she'd ever had. Dominic paused at the threshold, his body a statue of control and violence poised to strike. Then, as the door handle turned slowly, painfully slow, his voice came one last time, quiet, sure, deadly. "No one touches what's mine." The door began to open, and the world, once again, held its breath. The silence that followed the click of the door stretched endlessly, broken only by the hum of hospital machinery and the soft breaths of the newborns. Time had slowed, compressing the entire world into that single room, into Isabella's trembling heart and Dominic's steady, lethal stillness. Then, the intruder outside the door hesitated, retreating a few steps down the corridor. The faint echo of boots faded into the distance, swallowed by the hum of rain. Dominic waited several seconds longer before lowering the gun, though his shoulders stayed taut. He moved to the window again, his eyes scanning the rooftops and corners of shadow. Whatever he saw made his jaw tighten further. When he finally turned back toward Isabella, the edges of his fury had softened, replaced by something far heavier: exhaustion. Hours later, the hospital had fallen into the kind of quiet that only came before dawn. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered occasionally, buzzing faintly, as if the storm outside still whispered through the power lines. Isabella sat half upright in her bed, her body sore, her eyelids heavy, but her mind unwilling to rest. Every creak in the hallway felt like a threat. Every passing footstep sent her heart racing. Yet somehow, amidst that fear, there was him, always there, like the shadow of every decision she'd ever made. Dominic stood by the window, his figure half swallowed by darkness, half painted in pale moonlight. His coat hung loosely from his frame, the damp edges curling against the floor. He hadn't moved in hours, hadn't spoken since the encounter, as though his silence was both armor and confession. Isabella watched him quietly, her gaze tracing the outline of his reflection against the glass. There was something painfully human about the way he stood. Shoulders heavy, head bowed slightly, a man carrying too many ghosts. The tension between them was no longer sharp and loud. It was quiet, suffocating, built from everything left unsaid. Finally, his voice broke the silence, low, gravelly, the kind that seemed to come from deep inside a wound. "I dreamed of this," he said, eyes still on the window. "You, holding our children." His reflection looked almost foreign. A man whispering into the night, not sure if he deserved to be heard. Isabella's fingers tightened around the blanket. "Dreams don't erase what you did," she murmured, her voice soft but cold. Dominic turned slowly, and for the first time since he'd arrived, his expression was completely bare. No arrogance, no command, just regret, raw and unfiltered. "I know," he said quietly, "but I'd give up everything. The power, the name, all of it, if it meant you'd look at me the way you used to." The confession struck her like a physical thing. She wanted to scoff, to remind him that love wasn't a currency he could bargain with, but his voice, the tremor buried in it, made the words stick in her throat. She swallowed hard, her eyes darting to the sleeping triplets. "And what then?" she whispered. "You walk away from the life you built and think that makes us safe? That it makes me forget?" He took a slow step forward, the sound of his shoes muffled against the tile. "No," he said, his gaze never leaving hers, "but it makes me human again." Her chest tightened. "You were always human, Dominic. You just stopped actin'. Gee, like it." He froze halfway between her and the window, her words cutting through him with surgical precision. The muscle in his jaw flickered, his breath deepening as though steadying against something unseen. The silence between them thickened, not empty, but full of old echoes. The sound of their laughter in another life, the whispered promises under a dim lamp, the way he used to trace her spine when the world outside went to hell. "Dominic," she warned softly, her voice trembling despite herself. He moved again, closing the distance between them in slow, measured steps. His presence filled the space, not because of his size or strength, but because of the emotion that came with him, dark and magnetic. When he reached her bedside, his hand hesitated for just a moment before sliding up to her jaw, his touch impossibly gentle. Her skin burned beneath his fingers. "You still feel it too," he said, voice barely above a whisper. The air seemed to stop. Isabella's breath caught, her pulse quickening beneath his touch. She wanted to deny it, to tell him she'd moved on, that the part of her that once belonged to him had died the day he left. But she couldn't, because the truth was written in her heartbeat, wild, uneven, betraying her resolve. His eyes searched hers, desperate, burning, full of a longing that had nowhere to go. The distance between their lips was a breath, a heartbeat, a memory waiting to happen again. Her voice came out as a trembling whisper. "You can't just walk back into my life and expect everything to stop hurting." Dominic's thumb brushed the corner of her lip, and his answer came in a whisper that felt like both apology and surrender. "I don't expect it to stop. I just need you to know I never stopped loving you." Her chest ached with the weight of it, with the truth, the cruelty, the hope buried in those words. For a moment, the world shrank to the space between them, her heart against his hand, his breath mingling with hers, the faint hum of the machines syncing with their silence. Then, all at once, the spell shattered. The sharp, unmistakable sound of glass breaking tore through the hallway. Both their heads snapped toward the door. The babies stirred at the sudden noise, one letting out a soft, frightened cry. Dominic's hand dropped instantly, his eyes flicking to the shadows beyond the glass panel near the door. The soft light from the corridor spilled into the room, fractured now by movement. Isabella's stomach dropped. "Dominic," she whispered, barely audible. He motioned for silence, his expression transforming once again. The man she loved slipping behind the armor of the one she feared. He reached inside his coat, retrieving the gun he'd hidden earlier, checking the chamber with practiced precision. The sound had come from the far end of the hallway, but it was moving closer. Footsteps crunching faintly over the scattered shards of glass. Isabella's hands shook as she pulled the triplets closer to her chest. Her mind raced, caught between instinct and dread. "You said they wouldn't come tonight," she whispered. Dominic didn't look at her. I was wrong. He moved toward the door, his body tense, his stance sharp and fluid. The lights flickered again, once, twice, before stabilizing into a dull yellow glow. The hallway outside was silent now, but the air had changed. Even without seeing, Isabella could feel it. The danger pressing closer, the tension twisting tighter. Dominic glanced back at her once, his eyes dark and full of command. "No matter what happens," he said quietly, "you don't leave this room. You hear me?" She wanted to argue, to tell him she couldn't just sit there while he walked into danger again. But her voice failed her. He stepped closer to the door, gun angled low, his ear near the frame. The faint hum of hospital lights buzzed overhead, masking the subtle scrape of movement just outside. He lifted his hand slowly, signaling for her to stay silent. A long moment passed. Nothing, just stillness, the kind that made every second feel like an eternity. Then came another sound, softer this time, deliberate, the tap of something metal against tile. Dominic's jaw tightened. "He's here," he breathed, more to himself than her. Isabella's heart pounded so violently she thought it might wake the babies. She bit down on her lip to keep from crying out. The doorknob twitched once. Dominic's stance shifted, muscles coiled. Another twitch, then a pause. And then, the unmistakable creak of the door beginning to open. Dominic raised his gun, his eyes narrowing. Isabella couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The babies whimpered softly, and she prayed the sound wouldn't give them away. Dominic took one silent step forward, his finger steady on the trigger, the dim light outlining the sharp planes of his face, part man, part shadow. A figure appeared in the doorway, a blur of black clothing and gloved hands. Dominic reacted instantly. The gunshot was muffled, controlled, precise, but its echo still rang through Isabella's bones. The man dropped to the floor without a sound, a flash of crimson blooming on the sterile white tile. For a moment, everything froze again. Isabella stared in shock, her hands clamped over her mouth. Dominic didn't look back. He stepped over the fallen man, scanning the corridor with lethal calm. "There'll be more," he muttered. "Dominic," she hissed, her voice cracking. "Stop, please." He turned slightly, his eyes softening for a fleeting second, and in that second, she saw it again. The man behind the monster, the lover behind the fighter. Then the sound of hurried footsteps echoed from the stairwell, multiple this time. Dominic's expression hardened. "They're not leaving without blood." He closed the door again, locking it, his movements fast, controlled. His eyes met hers one last time, dark and unyielding. "Stas, I with them," he said, his voice low, final. She shook her head, tears streaming. "Don't do this." But he was already turning toward the hallway, his body cutting through the light like a blade, and as his shadow disappeared beyond the doorway, the babies began to cry, the sound mingling with the distant thunder that rolled outside, echoing through the night like a warning. Somewhere down the hall, another gunshot rang out, and Isabella knew. The reunion of shadows had only just begun. The corridor exploded with sound, the crack of gunfire tearing through the sterile calm of the hospital like thunder given shape. Dominic reacted before thought could form, his instincts sharper than the noise itself. He lunged for Isabella, forcing her down against the cold linoleum as bullets ripped through the door behind them. "Stay down," he barked, his voice raw, commanding, the echo of a man who had lived too long inside violence. Isabella's cry broke through the chaos. The triplets clutched tightly to her chest, their terrified whimpers drowned beneath the roar of destruction. She could smell the smoke, the metallic tang of blood already spilling somewhere nearby. Her heart pounded so violently she thought it might shatter her ribs. "You said they'd be safe," she screamed, her voice barely carrying over the noise. Dominic rolled, returning fire with deadly precision, each movement a dance of survival and fury. "I'll make sure they are," he shouted back, his tone equal parts promise and defiance. The muzzle flashes lit his face in staccato bursts, light and shadow flickering across the sharp lines of his jaw, the focused terror in his eyes. To her, it was like watching the man she loved and the man she feared become one. The acrid sting of gunpowder filled the room, curling like smoke through the cracks of her breaking heart. Dominic moved with terrifying grace, every step measured, every shot controlled, every breath drawn as though it could be his last. His coat whipped around him as he spun toward the doorway, the empty hallway beyond pulsing with danger unseen when. And the last shell casing hit the floor. The silence that followed felt unreal. Smoke hung thick in the air, swirling with the faint flicker of emergency lights. Isabella could hear her own pulse pounding in her ears, a frantic rhythm that refused to settle. Dominic turned, his breathing ragged, blood trickling from his arm where a bullet had grazed him. His eyes swept over her, checking, counting, needing to see her whole. "Are you hurt?" he asked, voice roughened with both fear and relief. She shook her head, but her body trembled uncontrollably. For a second, she couldn't find words, couldn't process the sight of him, wounded but alive, the man who had once destroyed her world now standing between her and death. Her hand moved before she could stop it, reaching for him. Her fingers brushed his face, tracing the cut near his temple, the blood smearing against her skin like ink from a memory she had tried to forget. "You're still bleeding for things you can't fix," she whispered, her voice trembling with too many truths. His jaw clenched, eyes dark and unreadable. "And you're still saving a man you shouldn't love," he replied softly. The words hung between them, heavy and electric, sparking against the silence left behind by violence. Isabella's breath hitched. The room felt smaller suddenly, the walls closing in, the storm outside echoing the storm within. He was too close, the smell of gunpowder and rain still clinging to him, the heat of his body radiating against hers. The baby's soft, uneven breaths filled the air, grounding her in the reality she wanted to escape and the danger she couldn't. He looked down at her, at the woman who had once been his redemption and his ruin, and for a heartbeat, everything else vanished. The sound of sirens far off, the dripping blood from his arm, the shattered door, it all blurred into nothing. His hand lifted, hesitated, then cupped her jaw again, thumb brushing the trail of her tears. "I thought I lost you," he murmured. "You did," she said, her eyes glistening. "But you came back anyway." His lips parted, an unspoken apology trembling between them, but she saw it, that flicker of vulnerability that he'd never shown anyone else. And before logic or fear could intervene, she leaned into his touch. The distance between them dissolved. Their lips met, fierce, broken, alive. It wasn't the kiss of lovers reunited, it was the kiss of two people drowning, clinging to each other in the wreckage of everything they had survived. Her hand slid up his chest, feeling the thrum of his heartbeat. Fast, unsteady, real. His fingers tangled in her hair, desperate, almost trembling. The kiss deepened, fueled by pain as much as passion, a confession neither could speak aloud. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless, the air between them thick with something far more dangerous than bullets. Memory. Isabella's eyes searched his face, trying to find the man she once trusted beneath the scars, the darkness, the years of silence. "Dominic," she whispered, almost pleading. But before he could answer, a faint sound cut through the stillness, a metallic clink, distant but distinct. Dominic's head snapped toward the doorway, his instincts reigniting. "They're regrouping," he muttered, his tone shifting back to steel. Fear rushed through her veins again. "You can't fight them all," she said, clutching his wrist. His gaze met hers, steady, unreadable. "Watch me." The raw determination in his voice chilled her more than the storm ever could. He pulled back, reloading the weapon with one hand, his wounded arms slick with blood. The tension between them, love, fury, fear, twisted into something that burned hotter than fire. She wanted to stop him, to hold him there. But the look in his eyes told her this wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about redemption. It was about every wrong he had ever done. Every night he had left her alone in the dark. He moved toward the shattered duo, Shui, shoulders squared, ready to walk back into the war he had brought with him. Isabella's breath caught. "Dominic," she started, her voice breaking. He paused, his back to her, the faintest tremor in his stance betraying something human beneath the armor. Without turning, he said quietly, "If I don't come back, tell them I fought for them." The words sank into her like ice, her throat tightened, tears burning her eyes. "Then don't give me something else to tell them," she whispered. He turned slightly, his eyes meeting hers one last time, full of fire, love, and something like farewell. The moment hung in the air, fragile as glass. Then he stepped into the hallway once more, disappearing into the dim corridor where the smell of smoke and gunpowder still lingered. The door swung shut behind him with a hollow thud. Isabella pressed a shaking hand to her lips, the taste of him still there, the echo of his heartbeat still in her chest. From the distance came another burst of gunfire, short, sharp, and final. Her stomach twisted. The babies stirred again, one letting out a soft cry that shattered the silence. She gathered them close, her tears falling freely now, whispering a prayer she wasn't sure anyone could hear. The red light above the door flickered, casting long, trembling shadows across the walls. Every second stretched unbearably. Then, somewhere down the hall, there came a new sound. Not gunfire, not footsteps, but something slow, dragging. Isabella's breath hitched. She turned toward the door, her pulse racing so hard she could barely think. Smoke curled through the crack at the bottom of the frame, and beneath it, the faintest outline of movement. Someone was coming, and as the storm outside raged harder than before, Isabella realized with a shiver. The fire between them had only just begun to burn. The first light of dawn crawled hesitantly through the cracks of the broken window, brushing the smoke-stained walls in muted gold. The hospital corridor, once filled with gunfire and screams, was now a graveyard of silence. The air still smelled of metal and ash, a bitter reminder that safety was a fragile illusion. Isabella sat beside the bed, her body aching from exhaustion, her soul suspended between relief and disbelief. Dominic lay there, pale, bloodied, alive. The doctors worked quickly around him, stitching torn flesh and pressing gauze against wounds that refused to stop bleeding. Every time he winced, her heart flinched too. She didn't know how long she had been sitting there, just watching him breathe. Hours, maybe, but time no longer felt real. The babies slept a few feet away, their tiny chests rising and falling in perfect rhythm, unaware of the storm that had nearly stolen everything from them. When the last doctor stepped away, murmuring something about recovery and luck, Isabella finally allowed herself to exhale. Her hands trembled in her lap, cold and colorless, as she looked at him, the man who had both destroyed her world and rebuilt it in the same night. His eyes fluttered open, heavy and unfocused, and when they finally found her face, a faint, pained smile tugged at his lips. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered, her voice barely holding together. Her throat burned from holding back too many tears, her heart from holding too much love. He studied her face as if memorizing it, then spoke softly, his voice rough with fatigue and something tender beneath it. "Then you'd have died hating me." For a moment, everything inside her stilled. She wanted to tell him how much she had hated him, the night she cursed his name, the morning she woke up to emptiness. But none of that hatred had ever survived the sound of his voice, the memory of his touch. "You think I ever stopped loving you?" she said instead, the words slipping out before she could stop them. The effect was instant. His breath caught, his body weakened by pain, still tensed as though struck by something invisible. His eyes widened, the faintest shimmer breaking through their darkness. "Say that again," he whispered, almost afraid the moment would disappear if he blinked. Tears blurred her vision. "I loved you through every nightmare, Dominic," she said quietly, "through every silence, every lie. But love isn't enough if you keep choosing darkness." The words hung in the air like smoke, fragile and true. Dominic swallowed hard, his gaze dropping to their children. They lay bundled together, unaware of the war that had ended only hours ago. His chest rose and fell unevenly, the fight still lingering in his veins, but his eyes softened, the kind of softness that only came from surrender. He reached for her hand, his fingers trembling but steady enough to find hers. "Then I'll choose you instead," he said, his voice a broken vow, but one that felt real for the first time. For a long moment she didn't move. She just watched him, watched the way his thumb brushed the back of her hand, as though he feared she might vanish if he stopped. And for the first time since the night he walked away, she believed him, not because of his words, but because of the way he looked at their children, that fierce, unguarded tenderness, the one that no mafia oath or empire could fake. The man who once ruled with fear now trembled before three tiny hearts. The mafia boss was gone. Only a man remained. The sunlight crept further across the room, washing over them like a quiet benediction. Outside, the storm had finally broken, leaving the world washed clean and glistening. For the first time in years, Isabella felt something like peace slip into her chest. Fragile, unfamiliar, but real. Dominic's head tilted toward her, eyes half closed, voice almost a whisper. "I thought I'd forgotten what this felt like," he said. "What?" she asked softly. "Being forgiven," he murmured. She stared at him for a long time. Me, her heart caught between pity and love. "I didn't say I forgave you," she said gently. "Then why are you still here?" he asked, his lips curling faintly. Her breath caught, because she didn't have an answer, not one that made sense, not one that could explain why even now, after everything, she couldn't walk away. Maybe it was love. Maybe it was the ghost that refused to die. Maybe it was both. The room was quiet, except for the steady hum of machines and the soft rhythm of the baby's breathing. Dominic's eyelids began to droop, the sedatives finally dragging him towards sleep. His hand still clutched hers, refusing to let go even as his body surrendered. She watched him in silence, memorizing the rise and fall of his chest, the faint trace of vulnerability that only came when he wasn't fighting the world. She brushed her thumb across his knuckles, whispering so softly he might not hear. "Then prove it." Outside, the city was waking. Sirens in the distance, tires splashing through wet streets, life moving on as though the night's chaos had never happened. Inside the room, time stood still. Isabella leaned back, exhaustion pulling at her bones. The babies stirred, one letting out a tiny cry that she quickly soothed, pressing her lips to their foreheads one by one. Her gaze drifted back to Dominic. The light on his face made him look almost young again, almost untouched by the life he had lived. But beneath the peace, a quiet unease lingered. Something about the silence felt too deliberate, too heavy. She looked toward the door. It was closed, the lock secure. But still, the hair on her arms stood on end. The hospital should have been bustling by now. Nurses, doctors, footsteps. Yet the hallway outside remained unnaturally still. She frowned, her instincts tightening. And then she heard it, faint at first, but unmistakable. A distant, echoing click. Not loud enough to be a gunshot. More like a door unlocking somewhere down the corridor. Her pulse jumped. She turned toward Dominic, but he was still, his body caught in the haze of sleep. "Dominic," she whispered, paired urgently, shaking his shoulder. He didn't wake. Another sound followed, heavier this time, like a boot scraping tile. The morning light no longer felt warm. It felt like warning. Isabella gathered the babies closer, her breath trembling as her gaze locked on the door. The world had gone quiet again. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that always came before something terrible. And just as her fear reached its peak, a shadow moved across the narrow glass window in the door, slow, deliberate, human. Her blood turned cold. The fire had ended, but the danger had not. The shadow outside the hospital door lingered for several breathless seconds. Isabella's pulse hammered in her ears as she clutched her babies closer, her voice a whisper of fear and defiance. The handle turned slowly, metallic and deliberate. She froze, but instead of danger, the door creaked open to reveal one of Dominic's loyal men, Marco, bandaged and exhausted but alive. Relief poured through her like rain after drought. "It's over," he said hoarsely. "They're all gone. You're safe now." The tension in her shoulders finally released. She didn't know whether to cry or collapse. When she turned to Dominic, his eyes were open, sleepy but alert, the faintest smile ghosting across his lips. He had heard everything. The nightmare was ending. Days blurred into nights, and the hospital became their cocoon of recovery. Dominic's wounds healed slowly, his body scarred but resilient. Isabella stayed by his side, refusing to leave him even when the nurses urged her to rest. There were moments when he woke screaming, flashes of fire, betrayal, the smell of gunpowder thick in his dreams, and she would hold his face until he remembered where he was. Her touch became his anchor, her voice his map back to sanity. And when their triplets cried in the quiet hours of the night, he would force himself out of D limp to the cradle and cradle them against his chest, learning fatherhood in whispered lullabies and trembling hands. It was in that stillness, between pain and peace, that Isabella realized something fundamental had shifted in him. The hunger that once lived in his eyes, for control, for vengeance, for dominance, was gone. In its place was something gentler, fragile, but real. One evening, as the sun dipped below the hospital blinds, he turned to her and said quietly, "I've buried too many ghosts to keep living like one." She didn't answer. She only reached out, threading her fingers through his, silently agreeing that it was time to begin again, somewhere far from the ashes of who they used to be. Weeks later, they left the city under false names, the skyline disappearing behind them like the closing of an old wound. The road stretched endlessly, winding through valleys and fading sunlight until the scent of salt reached them. When they finally arrived at the small coastal town, the sound of waves greeted them like forgiveness. The ocean stretched wide and endless, untamed, unjudging, eternal. Isabella stood on the cliffside, the wind tugging at her hair as Dominic carried the babies down toward the sand. For the first time in years, she smiled without the weight of fear pressing against her chest. Their new house stood near the edge of the shore, modest, sunlit, with peeling white paint and an overgrown garden where wildflowers tangled freely. Isabella loved it instantly. It wasn't the marble halls or chandeliers of his old empire, but it felt alive. Dominic spent his mornings fixing broken windows, planting herbs by the fence, learning the rhythm of ordinary life. The neighbors only knew them as Mr. and Mrs. Hale, a quiet couple with 3 bright-eyed children and a past no one dared to question. The days melted together in soft colors. Dominic would sit by the shore with the babies, letting the waves tickle their tiny feet. His laughter, once a rare, sharp thing, had turned easy and warm. Isabella often watched from the porch, her heart welling with disbelief that the man before her was the same one who once commanded a world of shadows. He had traded blood for gentleness, power for peace, and somehow it suited him more than any throne ever did. One golden morning she walked down to him, the sand cool under her feet. The sun painted the horizon in pink and amber hues, and the air smelled of salt and second chances. Dominic stood barefoot in the surf, holding one of the babies high above his head, while the others squealed with laughter at the waves rushing toward them. The sound was so pure, so untouched by the past, that her eyes filled without warning. She walked closer and slipped her arms around him from behind, resting her cheek against his back. "You still miss that world, don't you?" she asked softly, her voice half playful, half serious. He turned his head slightly, the breeze catching his hair, and shook it slowly. "No," he said. "For the first time, I don't need power. I have something worth living for." She smiled against him, the truth of his words warming her from the inside. Her hands splayed across his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heart, strong, alive, human. "Just don't forget," she murmured. "I didn't need saving, Dominic. I needed you to walk beside me." He turned to face her then, his expression soft and reverent. For a long moment, he simply looked at her, the woman who had seen him at his worst and still chosen to stay. Then, without a word, he leaned forward and pressed a kiss to her forehead, slow and deliberate. "Then let me walk beside you, forever," he whispered. The waves rolled in, gentle and endless, erasing their footprints in the sand as if the ocean itself was granting them a clean slate. Dominic drew her closer, their children giggling between them, the sound carried away by the wind. Isabella closed her eyes, letting the sea wash over the fragments of who they had been, the guns, the betrayals, the nights that bled into fear. What remained was this moment, a man who had once ruled darkness learning how to live in the light, and a woman who had once stood alone, finally allowing herself to be loved without losing herself. As the sun climbed higher, painting their faces in gold, Dominic whispered, "Do you think we'll ever really be free?" Isabella looked up at him, her eyes glimmering with quiet certainty. "Freedom isn't about forgetting," she said. "It's about choosing not to let the past define what comes next." He smiled faintly, then knelt to draw a heart in the wet sand, their initials inside it. A small wave rushed in, blurring the lines. "Even the ocean won't let us stay still," he said with a laugh. "Good," she replied, taking his hand. "Then we'll keep rewriting our story, every single day." The triplets' laughter echoed through the shore, their tiny footprints leading toward the edge of the sea. Dominic followed them, carrying the youngest in his arms. Isabella stood for a moment, watching, her heart full, her soul quiet. The wind tugged at her dress, carrying the scent of salt and something like hope. She thought of everything they had lost, and everything they had found in its place. Maybe redemption wasn't about starting over. Maybe it was about finally standing still long enough to let love catch up. As the waves crashed softly against the shore, Dominic turned and extended his hand toward her. "Come on, Mrs. Hale," he said with a teasing grin. "The tide's rising." She laughed through her tears, running toward him, her bare feet splashing through the surf. When she reached him, he caught her effortlessly, spinning her around as the children squealed around them. The sun caught in his hair, in her eyes, in the salt slick air between their laughter. And for the first time since their worlds had collided, there was no war, no vengeance, no fear. Only love, raw, imperfect, and infinite. The ocean roared louder, a living witness to their promise. Isabella pressed her hand to Dominic's chest, feeling his heartbeat steady beneath her palm. "Forever?" she asked softly. He nodded, eyes glimmering. "Forever." The tide rolled in again, washing away the last trace of their past. The blood, the fire, the name that once ruled men through fear. All of it dissolved into the horizon, leaving behind a single truth whispered between them. Love doesn't erase the darkness. It teaches you how to live after it. And as the sun rose higher over the sea, they stood together, a family reborn from ruin, walking into the light. Sometimes love doesn't die. It just hides behind pain, waiting to be found again. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to Heartwoven Tales, and press the bell icon so you never miss another tale that speaks to your soul. And please, share your thoughts in the comments. Your words mean more than you think.